story of redemption. Genesis 1:26 through 2:25. Here in this story, we're getting to the end of the creation process. It says that God created man in his own image and likeness. Male and female, he created them. That mankind is made in the image and likeness of God. That we are his ambassadors, his representatives, his glory bearers. And that we're commanded to be fruitful, to multiply over the face of the earth, so that the image and the glory of God goes out to all creation, but also that we have a responsibility as the image bearers of God to care for and to subdue, to take care of what God has created. That God gives authority to mankind. That he bestows authority to us as his image bearers to care for what he has created. And then after that, we get finally to the seventh day. That the seventh day is a day of rest. That at the end of the creation of man on the sixth day, God says of his creation that it's very good. Before this, God has said, after he's created every single thing, that it's good. But now he says it's very good, because now his work is complete. And now that his work is complete, God rests. He takes time to rest and to look on what he has created and what he has made that glorifies and brings him praise and honor and worship. And then now we get into another part of the creation story. It's a more detailed explanation of how God creates man. So God, he takes the dirt of the earth, the dust of the earth, and he forms man with his hands. This is different than all the other things that we've heard about God creating, because man isn't spoken into being. Man is formed with the hands of God. And after God forms man with his hands, he breathes life into him. That expresses a great deal of intimacy and closeness. A closeness that God has with this creation of man that isn't the same with the other things that God has created, with the birds of the air, with the beasts of the field, or with the stars and the moon, and all those different kinds of things. That God has a personal relationship. He has an intimate closeness with man, whom he creates with his hands and whom he breathes life into. So after that, God takes man, who he's just formed and breathed life into, and he creates this lush place for him to be able to live in. He creates this garden. He talks about what is in the garden, that this garden is watered by 4 different rivers. So there's a lot of water there. There's also a lot of trees that are there that are pleasing to the sight, that are also good for food. And as God does that, he tells Adam, be fruitful and multiply. You're going to take care of all the things that are in here. One of the other things, though, is that God puts in the center of this garden, this place that he's created for man to live, the tree of life. And that tells us a lot, because at the very center of this masterpiece of this garden is the tree of life. And that tree of life is something that God has a special purpose for, because when he talks to man, he says to man, you can eat from every tree in the garden, just do not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So there's another tree in the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that God commands man not to eat from. Why? Because if he eats from that tree, God says that he will die. If you eat from this tree, you will die. But then of every other tree in the garden, you may eat. So of every tree in the garden you may eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, do not eat from it, because if you eat from it, you're going to die. So what does that tell us about the tree of life being placed in the center, and about the command that God gives to Adam? That God intended for mankind to always eat from the tree of life, to have eternal life. He created us to be eternal beings, to share fellowship with him for all of eternity. And as God does that, God observes, okay, so I've created man, I've put him in this really nice place, a place that gives him shelter, a place that's beautiful to be in, because these trees look really nice, there's food that's there, so he has food to eat, there's water to drink, all those kinds of things. I've given him purpose to care for this garden. And then God says something that's really interesting. He says, it's not good for man to be alone. Which is a little bit weird, right? Because if man exists and God is there with him, and man has fellowship with God, then Is man really alone? No, right? Because man has fellowship with God. But then God says it's not good for man to be alone. So then, that's an interesting thing for us to think about. But as God says it's not good for man to be alone, he brings all the different created beings, all these different creatures before man to see which one of these things that God's created would be a complement, a helpmate to man. That would be his complement. And imagine this kind of picture. If you've ever been on a blind date or something like that, and you have a friend that tries to set you up with all of these different people. Let's imagine that your friend is setting you up on like a really big group speed date kind of thing. And one by one, all of these different people that your friend brings before you, you just start digging it. And you have these different things that you point out about how this one isn't the right for you. Maybe that one has like a really whiny laugh or a big nose or something like that. And then that becomes the name that you have for that person. Imagine and picture that kind of scene with man and God, as God brings forth all of these different creatures, all these different animals before man. The things that man thinks about that creature. Oh, that one has like a really weird long nose, or that one has really sharp teeth, or something like that. That became its name. And it goes through all of the created beings, all the different animals in the earth, and none were found to be a complement for man. So what does God do? God causes man to fall asleep, and he puts him into this deep slumber. And God forms a person out of man. He takes a piece of Adam out of his rib and forms woman. That's an important thing to think about too, because remember, in this kind of culture, different parts of the body have different kinds of connotations. If in most cultures the feet are really disgusting, so if woman was made out of foot, out of the toe or something like that, that conveys to us different kinds of symbolism about submission, about domination, of power, of if it's part of the head or the hand, that conveys a different type of symbolism as well. But being formed out of the rib, out of a place where we feel our emotions, out of a place where we talk about how we feel things in our heart. The seat of the emotions is in this area. A person that is his complement. It's not just his intellectual equal, it has the same passions, the same desires as man. So God does that. He creates woman out of the side of man. And then when woman appears before man, when God wakes Adam up and presents woman to man, he just says, whoa! Wow, wow, it's woman. Wow, man. And one of the things that we find about that, there's a commentary that is in there. It talks about how, and this is how a man should leave his mother's and father's household, and the two shall become one flesh. That man and woman are to become one flesh. And now we're talking about the institution of marriage here. But here's the other thing that's really interesting in verse 25. It talks about how man and woman, how they were naked, but they were not ashamed. So that's an important thing for us to think about, because it's not just physical nakedness that we're talking about. That the shame that they might experience, and the shame that even today that we might experience, isn't simply relegated to physical nakedness. When we do something wrong, you know this to be true, when a little kid does something wrong, and they know they did something wrong, what do? They try to hide what they might have done. They run away from that figure of authority. Because why? Because they're ashamed. When we know that we've done something wrong, and we're not fearing the punishment that might come from it, there might not be any physical form of punishment, but when we are in a deep relationship with someone, and we know that what we've done is wrong, and that what we've done has hurt that other person, what happens to us? Our conscience that's within us causes us to be ashamed. And that's the story of redemption.